Question 48, how does the unbelieving community respond to the believing community? So remember, we talked last week about how there's these two different communities, the believing and the unbelieving. Now the question is, how does the unbelieving community respond to the believing community? There is hostility toward believers, expressed in persecution and temptation. But by God's common grace, unbelievers may also be restrained and at times show love to believers. So let's break that down. How does the unbelieving community respond to the believing community? There is hostility toward believers. So let's look at that. Number one, Genesis 3:15. What word does the Bible use to describe the relationship between the two communities? Enmity, right. And enmity means what? Hostility. So how does the unbelieving community respond to the believing community? There is hostility toward believers. Okay. So now it says there is hostility toward believers expressed in persecution. So let's look at that. Number two, Genesis 4:3-8. And so you can see this is an example of where some of the verses are designed to just follow on. So someone reading a Bible can just go on to the next page. But if you're on a phone, obviously it takes longer. So could the next person read out 3 and then the next person 4, and we go up to verse 8, please. So how do we see this hostility worked out with Cain and Abel?
Cain kills his brother.
Cain kills his brother, right? So that we would call that persecution. All right, so that's an example of how does the unbelieving community respond to the believing community? There is hostility toward believers expressed in persecution. So now let's look at 1 John 3:12. Who was influencing Cain? The evil one, right? He belonged to the evil one. Now, I think in the Catechism it used to then go to, I think a while ago, maybe it used to go to John 8:44. It's not in the Catechism, but just in case someone said to you, well, just because he's of the evil one, how do we know that he's influenced by the evil one? Let's just quickly go to John 8:44. I think this is a crucial Bible text. Okay, so Jesus is saying to people, your father is the devil, and you want to do what your father wants to do, which is a natural thing for children in general, to do what their father does. And so here you got the fact that if you're born of the devil, if you're one of the devil's offspring, then you will do the things the devil wants to do. And so the devil influences you. Do you think should that be added back into the Catechism there? Yeah?
I think maybe it should be in the leaders' guide so that for reference, it's on us.
Okay. Right. What question are we on? 48? Okay. So now let's go to Hebrews 11:4. So what did Abel have that Cain didn't have? Faith. Okay, right. So yeah, so Abel's in the believing community. Cain is in which community? The unbelieving community, which is influenced by who? The devil. Right, okay. So now let's look at Matthew 10:34-36. So what can happen in family life when one person becomes a Christian?
Enemies in his household.
Yeah, you can end up having enemies in your own household. Your own family now can start to see you as an enemy. A lot of people in this room have experienced that. And it's something I've seen consistently in council estate ministry. People become a Christian and they start getting lots of beef from their family about it. Big problem on council estates. I just want to add something to that. In the teacher's guide, under the for further study box for question 48, the second paragraph I've written, We often view the division in our families as a bad thing. However, it is really a blessing because God is not allowing us to stay in the unbelieving community. Instead, he pulls us out of the unbelieving community. Reformed theologian Stobb wrote, Jesus came splitting and splintering, organizing them into a kingdom of his own. So when you look at Matthew 10, 34 to 36, you see Jesus say, I didn't come to bring peace, but it's going to cause disunity in your family. And we can sometimes feel like that's a bad thing. But actually, it's a blessing because what it means is God's saying, I'm not going to leave you in the unbelieving community. I'm going to pull you out of that into the believing community. I'm not going to let you sit all comfortable, unified in your non-believing family. I'm going to pull you out. So it's actually a real blessing. So that part of what we wanted to do in the Catechism when we come to this stage is get them to see there is division there, but to see that as a blessing. That's a sign that Jesus cares enough that he pulls you out of that community. And then it will lead on to what we're going to look at soon, which is about, well, how do we then reach out to the unbelieving community? Question?
Have you had anybody questioning, is it like kind of cultish? Do you have people reacting negatively to you saying it's a good thing to be removed from your family? Or
Me personally, no, I haven't. I mean, I think most people I've catechized have said this is exactly what happened to me. Interestingly, the people I've found in general who haven't, I realize we're saying the people there, I've just said a loaded term in America. In general, people who I take through the Catechism who haven't had this hostility, guess what? Who wants to guess what?
Unbelievers.
It could be unbelievers. What's that? People in general from Afro-Caribbean backgrounds. In general. Now, I've also seen where there is hostility, because it's like, why are you leaving your dodgy church? I mean, why are you leaving our good church and going to your dodgy church now? That happens. Or why are you suddenly now getting really into the Bible? You seem to be taking it a bit too serious. What about your education? What about your job? You know, that kind of thing. But what I found is in general, and there's also sometimes you get hostility from if there's Rastafarianism. Why are you now going for that white man religion? But in general, I found the hostility seems to be more prominent in white working class families that either have a Catholic heritage, and it's like, why are you leaving Catholicism? Or don't have any Christian heritage, but are just like, you seem to have left us now. You're not into the things we're into anymore. I don't like that. And even parents, telling their kids they can't get baptized, even when they're grown, and that kind of thing. So, does anyone want to comment on that? You can disagree with me and say, you know what, that's...
Yeah, I would say sometimes even like saying that, well, like, why you always go to community group, or it seems like you're spending a lot more time in church and stuff like that. So there's subtle hostility there as well. So although they say they are Christians, and they probably are, but there's that religious aspect to them as well, where they're treating you, like religiously. So
you're saying even if you've got Nigerian family and their church goers and that, there can still be hostility where they're like, you seem to keep going to church stuff all the time. Yeah. And is that because it's like, why aren't you with the family?
Yeah, because it's culturally family men. So if you're not spending that much time with family, then they're like, what sort of Christianity is that?
Harriet?
I think there's another angle with it as well, in that at least for people as they get older, I think sometimes as you're younger it's more about, why aren't you studying as hard as you're going to church or whatever, how are you able to get the balance? But I think as you get older there's another angle of, how are you ever going to meet anybody when you're constantly in church? And I get that even from Christians. Why you're always going to church, you're always doing something for the church, how are you ever going to meet anyone? And as you get older, that seems to be the new argument for not going to, or being engaged in church stuff.
I've just noticed a difference. I'm predominantly working with white, working class men who've come from broken homes, so to them, disharmony with my family is nothing. so that's like accepted. But from my wife's point of view, there has been she's come from like a kind of functional family, middle class, where it's what we're doing is quite strange. So I just wondered, in the different contexts, how this would fit. Whereas I know how Rachel's mum would take it if she read this, she'd be like, and she's already thought a lot of the stuff was done strange, and so.
I think Ephraim's going to say something.
Well, not directly in response to that, but I remember the state that I grew up on. It was a very culturally mixed estate, and one thing I always, on reflection, remember quite distinctly is the fact that family loyalty was a huge thing as a value within white working class families, and you know, sometimes you'd even get those families, they were kind of known for certain things. You know what I mean? So like, you'd have certain crime families and they were known for certain kinds of, if you want a car, you go and see Jim. If you want like dodgy clothes, go and see Fred and his family, or like, you know what I mean? And the whole kind of family unit always seemed really so strong, and so I just think that even in terms of what you're saying, I guess, I mean, that was years ago in my experience. I don't know what it's like nowadays, but I guess that's definitely something that's going to be encountered in one way or another. Just when you seem to be disloyal to family ties, that's going to be beef.
Just adding on to Ephraim's point, I think that's right, and going in with Ian's point, even from a broken white working class family, you still have within that family is that if you're putting church first, you will know about it.
Yes.
You will know about it. You'll always get complaints, you'll always get just like sly comments, and you'll get temptation as well. So you would know about it, be like, why are you always at church? Kind of like that. I mean, what are they? I mean, I'm the one that brought you up, they didn't do anything for you. They just take your money. Why are you giving money to them for? So that's a big one. So it's a bit like that.
I think the point I was trying to make was, for me and for a lot of the men I'm working with, that response wouldn't hurt them so much because they're used to conflict. But for my wife, this kind of being separated, she'd find, so I'm about as a Christian, how would the Christian find it? Whereas I think somebody who's been brought up in a stable family would struggle a lot more than somebody who's grown up in a dysfunctional family to actually see being released from that family as a good thing. Whereas with me, I'm like, yeah, they're all nutters. Whereas my wife's like, oh, but I love my mum and my dad, what about my sister, what about my auntie? And so I'm just wondering how the Christian would perceive that as being good from a different context.
So the short answer is that the Urban Catechism has been contextualized for a specific culture. And so it's not going to be as effective with everyone from different cultures. So this is why I would be happy to wager a bet, if I was a gambling man, that you wouldn't be able to find a discipleship resource in the UK that talks about this stuff. And if you did, I would bet you that it's written from someone from an urban community, because this is not something that is on the radar in general in the majority culture in Britain, which is white middle class, in Christian circles anyway. So this is an example of, well, this is specifically contextualized, and you're going to find a lot of people it's written for will be like, oh, I totally experienced this. Even doing catechism with you, I'm getting beef from people. And then there'll be other people from other cultures who do this, and they'll be like, cool, that's a bit rich. And that's okay. That's okay. Like, it's impossible to write something that caters for everyone. That someone did do that. The Holy Spirit did it. It's the Bible. So we got the Bible for that. But this is a contextualization of discipleship for that. Having said that, there'll also be plenty of middle class people who will read this and be like, that's exactly what happened. I'm working on a council estate and my family think I'm nuts. They wanted me to be a doctor. Charles.
There's two other communities where it really happens. There's homosexual community, I think in Brighton. So that, especially even if it's just one member of the family is homosexual and you become an evangelical, that's that can be really tough, I think, for people. And also coming out of Islam, that would be there'd be lots of hostility, I would have thought.
Yeah, Islam, and that, that's a very, very good point. Okay, and now let's go John 17:14. So how does the world in general feel about Christians? Hates them. Right, okay, so here on this diagram, what you've got is you've got two communities, the believing and the unbelieving community, and from the unbelieving community is hostility. So that's why I got this picture of the soldier there with the gun, yeah? Because there's this hostility going on, a general attitude of hostility from the world to the believing community, okay? Any questions on that? On there is hostility towards believers expressed in persecution. Okay. Moving on. So the next thing is, and temptation. So there is hostility toward believers expressed in persecution and temptation. So let's look now at number 3 there. Let's look at Numbers 25, verses 1 to 3. What did the unbelievers do to the believers?
Turn them away, have them encourage them to worship another God.
Yeah. So specifically it says in verse 2, what did they do? Invited them to sacrifice to their God. So what are they doing to them? Tempting them, yeah? So we're saying that this hostility that the world has to unbelievers, it isn't just expressed in persecution, it's expressed in temptation. What I find is some people, when they see this chart and they hear this stuff, they're like, no, I've got loads of mates, they don't persecute me. And it's like, okay, on your birthday, did they ring you up and say, are you coming out for my birthday? That's tempting, right? That's tempting you to go out and get drunk with them. So what you'll find is these two ways consistently the world actually shows its hostility towards us. Temptation and persecution. So in the West, we don't have as much persecution as people do in the rest of the world, right? But then we have a lot of temptation from friends of ours and from family members. So how many people in your churches this Christmas holiday are going to get drunk and maybe do drugs because of friends and family? I'd say it's probably more than we would like, right? It happens every Christmas, yeah? And that is exactly this thing playing out, seed theology. The believing seed and the seed of the devil. Okay, but let's carry on this Numbers tip, because it's not always that clear, because some people read this about Numbers and they're like, oh, they're just inviting them along to their thing, innit? Like, of course you do that. If you believe in your gods, you're going to invite people along. They're just being kind. Well, let's now go to Numbers 25:18. Okay, so we've skipped out a lot of verses here, but basically, you can see there in 18, they treated you, the Midianites treated you as enemies when they deceived you in the Peor incident. So when these women were getting with the Israelite men, and then inviting them to their place, what was really going on? What were they doing? Deceiving them. Do you see how it's not so innocent now? They were actually deceiving them. When you have non-Christian family and friends trying to tempt you away from your Christian life, there's something sinister going on there. Whether people realize they're doing it or not, there is something sinister going on. Okay, so now let's go to Numbers 31:16, and we get even a bit deeper with this story. Okay, so here you've got, the question is, who advised them to do this? Balaam, right? So there's a guy called Balaam who actually advised the Midianites or Moabites, I think they're working together against the Israelites here, actually advised them the way to get the Israelites is to send pretty women their way. That's the way to get them. Do you see how sinister this is? This is so sinister. Here you've got a guy who says to a bunch of people, if you want to get the Israelites, send some women their way. They will fall for the women, then the women can invite them to worship to their gods. This is, yeah, set up chicks, right? It is. It's a honey trap, right? It's a honey trap. It's as sinister as that poor Ute who got killed in London, right? That's how sinister and ugly it is. Because the same devil who was behind that honey trap is the same devil behind this one in Numbers, and the same one that keeps trying to set up our people all the time. Very, very sinister. We will come on more about this Balaam stuff. It's fascinating. And in the Catechism, I'm just giving you snippets. But when you study these chapters, it's just deep. You know, it's like, wow. Okay, so how does the unbelieving community respond to the believing community? There is hostility toward believers expressed in persecution and temptation. And for Numbers 25:18, did I miss out the question, why did they invite the Israelites to idolatry? I didn't. Okay, all right, cool. So it's expressed in persecution and temptation, but by God's common grace, unbelievers may also be restrained and at times show love to believers. So here's the bit that you're all wanting me to explain, I'm guessing, because people are not, hang on a minute, I know non-Christians who show me love. So how do you explain that? Well, by God's common grace. That's what we're going to look at now, number 4. So please turn to Matthew 5:45. Does God give blessings to unbelievers? Yeah. And that's called his common grace. His grace that is common to all people. Yeah, his grace, things he gives people that they don't deserve. Good things they don't deserve, yeah? And that, right, God gives even to non-believers. There's common grace that he gives to everyone. You know, some of your favorite singers aren't believers, right? And you're like, this person's mad talented. God gave them that gift. That's common grace. Yeah. Let's move on to the next bit. But by God's common grace, actually, no, turn to the Teacher's Guide. Got a definition of common grace. This is by John Murray. John Murray says, common grace is, I've highlighted it for you, every favor of whatever kind or decree. Every favor or, I don't know if that's a typo. Every favor of whatever kind or decree, falling short of salvation, which this undeserving and sin-cursed world enjoys at the hand of God. This includes restraining sin in unbelievers and giving unbelievers gifts. Right? So common grace is every favor that falls short of salvation. So any favor that God gives people that isn't saving them, that's his common grace, right? And this undeserving and sin-cursed world enjoys it at the hand of God, right? And this includes restraining sin in unbelievers. So God stops unbelievers from being as evil as they could be. That's common grace, right? And he gives unbelievers gifts. So gifts that unbelievers have, that is common grace, okay? Okay, so how does the unbelieving community respond to the believing community? There is hostility toward believers, expressed in persecution and temptation, but by God's common grace, unbelievers may also be restrained and at times show love to believers. So let's now look at number 5. Let's look at Numbers 22, 4-6. Before the women come to tempt the Israelite men, this story now happens. So you've got to understand the order. This is what happens first, right? So if we can carry on reading, please, at verse 4. What did Balak ask Balaam to do? So let's have it a bit louder.
Put a curse on these people.
Put a curse on the Israelites, right? Put a curse on them. Okay, let's now go to verses 21 to 35. We're going to skip a few verses. So how did God restrain Balaam? Say it again. He used the donkey.
An angel of the Lord and the donkey he was using as transport.
Mm-hmm. It used it to do what? To speak to him. Anything else?
Stop him from going any further.
Stop him from going and doing what?
Sin.
Cursing God's people, right? So he does this to stop him going and cursing God's people. It's an amazing story. If you take children through the Catechism, if it's the first time they heard the story, it's quite amazing. Like one of my kids, when we did this in Catechism, they went, if this wasn't in the Bible, if I just heard this somewhere else, I'd think it was a made-up story. So here you've got God restraining Balaam. What do we call that? Common grace. This is common grace, okay? Right, so now let's go to Numbers 23, 5 to 12. So what were the results of God restraining Balaam?
He then blessed the people instead of cursing them.
So the results are God's people get blessed by Balaam. So how does the unbelieving community respond to the believing community? There is hostility toward believers expressed in persecution and temptation, but by God's common grace, unbelievers may also be restrained and at times show love to believers. So Balaam is not a Christian, okay? He is definitely not one of God's people, right? Okay, Balaam's a proper dodgy geezer, right? And he's into weird stuff. And he gets hired to put a curse on God's people, and he's up for doing it. But God restrains him and makes it so that Balaam ends up blessing God's people instead. And this is a classic example of seed theology. So there is this hostility from the world towards us believers. But God is continually restraining unbelievers. And that's why you got friends and family who will still be kind to you and will still show love to you. Has anyone got any questions about that? Something that's worth bearing in mind about this hostility that the unbelieving community has for believers is a lot of non-believers will not be that aware of the hostility they have towards believers. A lot of them will not be aware of it. A lot of the hostility will be, I think, and I'm not getting this from scripture, but just from experience, I think a lot of the hostility is kind of a thing deep down that people don't really know the reason for. So, for example, who here is an Arsenal fan, or who used to be an Arsenal fan? And I can put my hand up. So you know, right, as an Arsenal fan, that when you're chatting to somebody, have a good conversation, and then they tell you they're a Spurs supporter, what happens?
I'm not a typical Arsenal fan.
Okay, so what happens, Gabs?
I like Tottenham.
I can tell you what,
Yeah.
a sensation of injustice and hatred towards Tottenham.
Okay.
Like you do.
Yeah.
Absolute war. Tottenham can't stand it.
You see a Tottenham shirt and you're a gooner. How do you feel?
I think it's gone.
Yeah, there's something not right about it. It's like, something not right about that. It's unpleasant. I see a Spurs top, even though I haven't supported Arsenal for years, yeah, I see a Spurs top and it's unpleasant. It's like, right, now here's the thing, right? If you ask me why is that, I don't know. I just know I have this feeling. But, and people at New Life know this because I preached this when I preached on seed theology. The reason why Arsenal fans hate Spurs fans is because about 100 years ago, there was a big controversy, right? There was a big controversy about a match and who won it and who actually ended up winning the cup. There's a big controversy. Now, that is from years ago. Most Arsenal and Spurs fans don't know about that and don't know that's where all the beef comes from. But there's this beef. Now, same way, there's a lot of non-Christians who there's something about Christians that they find unpleasant. There's something about non-Christians and the Christians going off to church and all that kind of thing that just rubs them up the wrong way. But they can't put their finger on it. They don't know exactly what it is. And I would say it's kind of a similar thing. So I'm not saying that your families who are non-believers are all out every day thinking, oh, I hate them, and scheming against you. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying a lot of the time there will be something subtly within where they just feel a bit unpleasant about it. Now, having said that, there's other people that know about it and they say they hate Christians, and there are even people who will deliberately, intentionally mess you up. Like I was reading with my family last night, we were reading 1 Peter. Are we reading 1 Peter at the moment? In 2 Peter. No, we're reading 1 John now, yeah. And he warns about, or was it in 1 Peter? I don't know. Someone in my household, we were reading something that said about people secretly introducing heresies into the church. What is it? 2 Peter 2. So this must have been a few days ago. I think we were chatting about it last night.
In our
An internship group, yeah. So it's like there's actually people who secretly introduce heresies into the church, which means there are people that they actually have that hostility, they know about it, and they scheme accordingly. But in general, I'd say most of it is subtle. Would anyone like to comment on that? You can come back and say you don't agree, because what I'm saying here isn't based on scripture. It's just an observation of life. So I could be totally wrong. Okay.
A sense in which I guess scripture affirms that in that the non-believer is in darkness, their eyes are blinded, and so there's a sense in which they may well be blind to the hostility. They don't even see it as hostile or wrong because of their blindness to the gospel, and I guess those who are of the gospel.
Okay, so now you've got application question here, which is, are there ways you have been either tempted or persecuted by non-believers? Okay. If you say no to that, my suggestion is you are totally unaware. People say ignorance is bliss. Sometimes you get in Roehampton, you get someone who's just moved to Roehampton, and they say, oh, it looks like a real nice place to live. And you're just like, oh, ignorance is bliss. People say, oh, it seems really safe around here. Ignorance is bliss. You don't know what happened last night at midnight. It's like, so that's a good thing, I suppose, because then people think like, oh, it's good. But that's not a good thing if then you start doing stupid things, right? Yeah, walking around Danebury Avenue late at night on your own. That's not a good thing to do, right? Same way as Christians, people might think, no, I don't get tempted by non-believers. They're pretty good to me. Ooh. That's the kind of ignorance you don't want, because then you might end up slipping and not realize what's actually going on, and then you end up getting taken out. So, are there ways you have been either tempted or persecuted by non-believers? Are there ways God has used unbelievers, maybe it should say non-believers, are there ways God has used non-believers to bless you? So you see what we're trying to balance it out here, where we're trying to give people a sense of, listen, the world is not your friend. And at the same time to realize, but God will still bless you through the world. Because otherwise someone does this catechism question and that's it. Now they're not talking to anyone in their family no more. You're going to flop me, I stay away from you. But so instead we want them to see, no, there are ways that your family's still going to be able to bless you. There's still good things. There's good qualities about your family. There's good qualities about your friends. That's God's common grace. But at the same time, realize they're controlled by the devil if they're not in a believing community. And the devil will try to use them to mess you up. So just turn to the person next to you now and do those questions and then pray together off the back of that.